The red wax seal cracked under Damon Blackwood's fingers, and he knew his world was about to change forever. The parchment inside bore symbols he'd never seen before, ancient, twisted characters that seemed to mock him with their mystery. His jaw clenched as he stared at the incomprehensible text, feeling the weight of his family's expectant gazes from across his mahogany desk. Well? His father, the former alpha, leaned forward in his leather chair. What does it say? Damon's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rage building in his chest like a living thing. He was Alpha Damon Blackwood, leader of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories. He commanded respect through strength and ruled through fear. But this piece of paper made him feel like a helpless child. The words stuck in his throat like poison. I can't read it. The silence that followed was deafening. 3 floors below in the servants' quarters, Arya swept the cold stone floor of her tiny room, her movements automatic after 7 years of the same routine. At 19, she'd spent more of her life in service to the Blackwood family than she had with her own parents. Sometimes she wondered if she'd forget their faces entirely if not for the dreams. The dreams always came at dawn, just before the estate stirred to life. Her mother would appear, young and beautiful as she'd been before the rogue attack, speaking in languages Arya had never heard while awake. Ancient words flowed from her mother's lips like music, and somehow, Arya understood every syllable. Language is power, little wolf, her mother would whisper in these visions. Remember what I teach you. One day, you'll need it. Arya had dismissed them as her mind's way of coping with loss. What use were dream languages to a servant who could barely read common script? The sharp ring of the service bell jolted her from her memories. Kitchen duty. Again. She hurried through the mansion's labyrinthine halls, keeping her head down and her footsteps silent. 7 years of invisibility had taught her to move like a ghost. The Blackwood family preferred their servants seen only when needed, heard never. In the kitchen, Cook thrust a tray of coffee and pastries into her hands. Master Damon's study. And mind you don't spill. He's been in a foul mood all morning. Arya's stomach dropped. Damon Blackwood was always in a foul mood, but when he was particularly angry, servants had a tendency to disappear. She'd learned to make herself smaller, quieter, more forgettable whenever his temper flared. She climbed the stairs carefully, her worn shoes silent on the Persian runners. Through the study's heavy oak door, she could hear raised voices, Damon's parents, his beta Marcus, and several other pack members. All arguing. Incompetent fool. 7 days to respond. Challenge to your authority. Arya knocked softly and entered when Damon's harsh voice barked permission. The room reeked of tension and barely contained fury. Damon stood behind his desk like a caged predator, his dark eyes blazing with frustration. His black hair was disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. On his desk lay a single sheet of parchment covered in symbols that made Arya's breath catch. She recognized those characters. Her mother had taught her those exact symbols just last week in her dreams. Finally, Damon snarled, not even looking at her. Maybe some caffeine will help us think clearly about this mess. Arya set the tray down with shaking hands, her gaze drawn irresistibly to the mysterious letter. The ancient script seemed to pulse with meaning, each character unlocking memories of her mother's gentle voice explaining their significance. The Crimson Fang Pack, Marcus was saying, shaking his head grimly. They've never been this bold before. Sending demands written in the old tongue, it's either desperation or a declaration of war. But what does it say? Damon's father demanded. We've consulted every scholar in the territory. No one can translate it. Perhaps someone in the capital, another pack member suggested. We don't have time. Damon slammed his fist on the desk, making Arya jump. Coffee sloshed in the cups, but she managed to steady the tray. They expect a response. Soon. And we're standing here like idiots because we can't read their message. Arya's heart pounded as she stared at the letter. She could read it. Every word was as clear to her as if it were written in modern English. The first line alone made her blood run cold. Submit or watch your pack burn. She swallowed hard and backed toward the door, desperate to escape before anyone noticed her lingering. But fate had other plans. "Girl." Damon's voice cracked like a whip. Arya froze mid-step. "You're spilling coffee everywhere. Clean it up." She hadn't spilled anything, but she didn't dare contradict him. Grabbing a cloth from the tray, she knelt to dab at non-existent spots on the floor, praying he'd forget about her quickly. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered. "An alpha brought low by ancient scribbles. Maybe it's time to consider." "Consider what?" Damon's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Nothing, Alpha. Just, perhaps we should prepare for the worst." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Arya could feel Damon's fury radiating outward like heat from a forge. She kept her head down, focusing on her meaningless cleaning while anxiety twisted her stomach into knots. "Get out," Damon said quietly. Too quietly. "All of you. Now." Chairs scraped against hardwood as the room emptied. Arya started to follow, but his voice stopped her cold. "Not you." She turned slowly, cloth still clutched in her trembling hands. Damon stood silhouetted against the tall windows, his broad shoulders rigid with tension. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 7 years, he said finally, not looking at her. "You've worked in this house for 7 years." "Yes, Alpha." Her voice was barely a whisper. "In all that time, have you ever heard me called weak?" The question felt like a trap. "No, Alpha." And yet today. He picked up the mysterious letter, holding it like it might bite him. "Today, I am powerless against a piece of paper." Arya remained silent, unsure what response he wanted. In her experience, silence was usually safest around angry alphas. Damon turned then, his dark eyes finding hers for the first time in years. The intensity of his gaze made her want to flee, but she forced herself to stand still. "Tell me, little maid," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Do you think your alpha is weak?" It was definitely a trap. But as she stared into his furious, desperate eyes, she saw something that surprised her. Pain. The great alpha Damon Blackwood was hurting, and he was taking it out on the only person in the room who couldn't fight back. "I think," she said carefully, "that sometimes the strongest people face challenges that can't be solved with strength alone." His eyebrows rose slightly, as if her response surprised him. For a heartbeat, his expression softened. Then his mask of cold authority slammed back into place. "Get out," he said dismissively. "And send word to the capital. I need their best linguists here within 2 days." Arya curtsied and hurried toward the door, relief flooding through her. She'd almost escaped when his voice caught her one final time. "Girl." She paused in the doorway without turning around. "If you ever see me brought low by my enemies," he said quietly, "remember that wolves who show weakness don't live long in this world." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but beneath it, Arya heard something else. A plea. As if he were asking her to remember him as strong, even if everything fell apart. She nodded without speaking and slipped from the room, closing the door softly behind her. Her hands shook as she made her way back to the servants' quarters, the image of those ancient symbols burned into her memory. That night, as moonlight streamed through her small window, Arya lay awake thinking about the letter. In her dreams, her mother had taught her that the old language held power, the power to unite packs, to declare war, to change the course of history. Submit or watch your pack burn. She'd read the first line clearly, but there was so much more. Threats, ultimatums, demands that would shake the very foundation of everything Damon had built. The Crimson Fang pack wasn't just challenging his authority, they were planning to destroy him entirely. And only she knew what they were truly up against. As sleep finally claimed her, Arya's last conscious thought was a question that would change everything. Should she tell him what she knew, or let the proud alpha face his downfall alone? The answer would come sooner than she expected, in ways she never could have imagined. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in the darkness, enemies circled closer to their prey. Chapter 2. 3 days of failure had turned Alpha Damon Blackwood into a walking powder keg. Arya could feel the tension radiating from the dining room as she arranged the evening serving platters in the kitchen. Cook muttered prayers under her breath while ladling soup into the fine china bowls, and even the other servants moved with unusual caution. When an Alpha's patience wore thin, everyone in the house suffered. "Third linguist today," whispered Sarah, one of the younger maids, as she polished silverware with nervous energy. "Came all the way from the capital, took one look at that letter, and shook his head just like the others." Arya's stomach clenched. She'd been having the dreams more frequently since seeing the letter, her mother's voice growing more urgent, the ancient words flowing through her mind like a river threatening to overflow its banks. Each night, she woke with her heart pounding and the taste of fear in her mouth. "Submit or watch your pack burn." Those first words haunted her, but they were only the beginning. In her dreams, her mother had shown her the complete message, line by terrible line. The Crimson Fang pack wasn't just making threats, they were delivering an ultimatum that would destroy everything Damon had built. "Girl." Cook's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. "Stop daydreaming and help me with these trays. The family's already seated, and you know how the Alpha gets when dinner's late." Arya nodded and lifted the heavy tray of soup bowls, her hands automatically steadying despite the tremor in her chest. 7 years of service had taught her to function even when fear clouded her mind. She followed Sarah through the swinging doors into the formal dining room, where the Blackwood family and their closest associates had gathered around the massive oak table. The atmosphere was suffocating. Damon sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, but there was nothing regal about his posture. His jaw was clenched so tight Arya could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and his dark eyes held a wild edge that made her want to back away slowly. His parents flanked him, his father's face grave with concern, his mother picking at her food with the distracted air of someone expecting bad news. Damon's younger sister, Luna, sat across from Marcus, the beta, while several other pack leaders and family friends filled out the remaining chairs. The conversation was stilted, careful, as if everyone was walking through a minefield. "The scholars from the Eastern Territories should arrive tomorrow," Damon's father said, cutting into his roast with mechanical precision. "Perhaps they'll have better luck with the translation." "Perhaps," Damon replied, but his tone suggested he held little hope. Arya moved quietly around the table, setting bowls before each guest with practiced efficiency. She kept her eyes down and her breathing steady, trying to make herself invisible. But she could feel the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on everyone present. "The Crimson Fang pack has always been aggressive," Luna said carefully, "but they've never been bold enough to make direct threats before." "What could have changed?" "Desperation," Marcus suggested, taking a long drink of wine. "Or stupidity. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." A few nervous chuckles rippled around the table, but Damon didn't join in. He sat in brooding silence, his untouched soup growing cold while he stared at nothing. Arya had just finished serving the soup course when Marcus leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance that came from being the Alpha's closest friend. "You know," he said, swirling wine in his glass, "in all my years as Beta, I never thought I'd see the day when our great Alpha would be brought to his knees by a piece of paper." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Marcus," Damon's mother said quickly, her voice carrying a warning. But Marcus was either too drunk or too foolish to heed it. "I mean, it's just writing, right? Scratches on parchment. How hard can it be to figure out?" He gestured carelessly with his wine glass. "Maybe we're overthinking this. Maybe it's just some primitive scribbling that doesn't mean anything at all." Damon's knuckles went white where they gripped his soup spoon. "Perhaps," Marcus continued, emboldened by what he mistook for silence, "we should consider the possibility that our fearless leader isn't quite as capable as we." "Enough." The word came out as a growl, low and dangerous. But Marcus had crossed a line and seemed determined to leap over it entirely. "I'm just saying, Damon, that maybe it's time to admit you're in over your head. A real Alpha would have solved this problem by now instead of." Damon's chair scraped back from the table as he rose to his feet, his massive frame blocking out the chandelier light. "What did you say?" The dining room fell silent except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Arya, who had been moving toward the kitchen to retrieve the main course, froze mid-step. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "I said," Marcus replied, his voice slightly slurred but his eyes challenging, "that maybe you're not the alpha we thought you were. Maybe the Crimson Fang pack chose their timing well. Maybe they know something about your capabilities that the rest of us are just figuring out." If Arya had thought the silence was oppressive before, it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of it now. Damon's chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, but she could see the rage building behind his eyes like a storm gathering strength. "You think I'm weak?" Damon's voice was deadly quiet. "I think," Marcus said, rising unsteadily to meet Damon's gaze, "that a strong alpha doesn't let his enemies dictate terms. A strong alpha doesn't spend 3 days cowering behind scholars and linguists." "A strong alpha. A strong alpha," Damon snarled, "doesn't tolerate insubordination from his beta." The tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. It was at that exact moment, with Damon's fury reaching its peak and the entire room holding its breath, that Arya chose to enter with the main course tray. Her timing couldn't have been worse. She pushed through the swinging doors with a heavy tray of carved roast and roasted vegetables, completely unaware of the confrontation unfolding before her. The weight of the tray made her movements slightly clumsy, and her hands, already shaking from the general tension in the house, trembled as she approached the table. Damon whirled around at the sound of the doors, his wild eyes landing on her like a predator spotting prey. In that moment, seeing the lowly servant girl who had witnessed his humiliation, something inside him snapped completely. "Get out," he roared, his voice echoing off the dining room walls. Arya stumbled backward, startled by the violence in his tone. The heavy tray wobbled in her hands as she tried to steady herself, but Damon was already moving. Blinded by rage and humiliation, desperate to reassert his dominance in any way possible, he lashed out. His hand struck the edge of the tray with enough force to send it flying from Arya's grasp. China shattered against the hardwood floor in an explosion of ceramic and food. Gravy splattered across the Persian rug, and chunks of roast scattered like debris from a battlefield. Arya cried out as she lost her balance, her feet slipping on the spilled gravy. She went down hard, her knees hitting the floor with a crack that made several people around the table wince. Pain shot through her legs, but it was nothing compared to the terror that flooded her system as Damon loomed over her like an avenging angel. "Look what you've done," he bellowed, his face flushed with fury. "Clumsy, worthless." "Damon, stop," his mother pleaded, half rising from her chair. But her son was beyond reason. The humiliation of the past 3 days, Marcus's challenge to his authority, and the constant pressure of the mysterious letter had finally found an outlet. And that outlet was the small, frightened girl cowering at his feet. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded letter, the source of all his recent torment. With a vicious motion, he threw it at Arya's face, the parchment striking her cheek before fluttering to the gravy-soaked floor beside her. "You want to be useful for once in your miserable life," he snarled, towering over her prone form. "Translate this. Figure out what these symbols mean, or I swear I'll throw you out into the wilderness to fend for yourself." The dining room had gone dead silent. Even Marcus seemed sobered by the display of raw fury. Arya's family and friends stared in shock, while the servants who had gathered at the kitchen door to see what was happening pressed themselves against the walls in terror. Arya stared at the letter lying beside her on the ruined floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ancient symbols seemed to glow in the candlelight, and suddenly her mother's voice was there in her mind, clear as if she were standing right beside her. "Language is power, little wolf. Remember what I teach you." Arya's voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, her eyes locked on the familiar characters. "I can read the first line." The silence that followed was different from before, not oppressive, but expectant. "Dangerous." Damon's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" Arya's hands shook as she reached for the letter, her fingers closing around the damp parchment. The symbols her mother had taught her in dreams suddenly made perfect sense, as clear as if they were written in modern English. The words rose in her throat unbidden, ancient syllables that felt strange on her tongue but rang with unmistakable authority. Kalen Mordan Veltar Nesh. 7 more Kila Thursdayven. The ancient words rolled off her tongue with surprising fluency, each syllable crisp and clear in the stunned silence of the dining room. She could feel every eye in the room fixed on her, but the language seemed to have a life of its own, flowing through her like water through a channel. And then, as the last echoes of the ancient tongue faded away, she translated in a voice barely above a whisper. Submit or watch your pack burn. 7 days to decide your fate. The effect was immediate and devastating. Damon staggered backward as if she'd struck him. His face went white, then flushed red with renewed fury and something else, fear. Around the table, chairs scraped as people rose to their feet in alarm. Someone gasped. Someone else cursed softly. A declaration of war, Damon's father breathed, his face grave. They're demanding your abdication. In 7 days, Luna added, her voice shaky. But that was 3 days ago, which means. For days, Marcus finished, all traces of his earlier arrogance gone. We have 4 days. The reality of their situation crashed over the room like a cold wave. This wasn't just a diplomatic dispute or a territorial disagreement. The Crimson Fang Pack was giving them an ultimatum, surrender or face total destruction. But Arya barely heard their frightened voices. The shock of speaking the ancient language aloud, of revealing a secret she'd hidden for years, combined with the terror of Damon's rage and the weight of every gaze in the room, was too much for her overwhelmed system to handle. The room began to spin around her. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision, and her mother's voice seemed to echo from a great distance. You've done well, little wolf. Rest now. Arya's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed unconscious onto the debris-strewn floor, the letters still clutched in her trembling fingers. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Damon's voice, raw with shock and something that might have been wonder. How did she know? How could she possibly know? But there was no one left conscious to answer him. In her dreams, as the chaos continued around her motionless form, Arya's mother smiled sadly and whispered words that would have chilled everyone in that room to the bone. The real test is just beginning, my darling. And I'm afraid it's going to get much worse before it gets better. The storm that had been gathering for 3 days had finally broken, but this was only the first rumble of thunder. The lightning was yet to come. Chapter 3. The first thing Arya noticed when consciousness crept back into her mind was the smell, antiseptic and medicinal herbs instead of the musty dampness of the servants' quarters. The second thing was the softness beneath her body. Clean sheets. A real mattress instead of the thin pallet she'd slept on for 7 years. She opened her eyes slowly, wincing as afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows. The medical wing. She'd only been here once before, when she'd fallen down the servants' stairs and twisted her ankle badly enough that Cook had insisted she see the pack doctor. Ah, you're awake. Dr. Hartwell's gentle voice came from somewhere to her left. You gave us quite a scare, young lady. Arya tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as her head spun like a top. The older man's weathered hands pressed gently on her shoulders, easing her back down onto the pillows. Easy now. You've been unconscious for 2 days. Your body needs time to readjust. 2 days. The words hit her like a physical blow. The letter. Damon's rage. The ancient words that had poured from her lips like water from a broken dam. It all came rushing back in vivid detail, making her stomach clench with remembered terror. The Alpha, she whispered, her throat dry as parchment. Is he furious? Oh yes. Dr. Hartwell's eyes crinkled with what might have been sympathy or amusement. He's been pacing the halls like a caged wolf, demanding to know when you'll wake up. I've been putting him off, but I suspect my medical authority only goes so far with an alpha in crisis. Crisis. That was putting it mildly. Arya closed her eyes and tried to piece together what had happened after she'd collapsed. The declaration of war. 7 days that had now become, what? 5? 4? How long do they have? She asked quietly. Dr. Hartwell studied her with intelligent gray eyes. You know what the letter said. It wasn't a question. Somehow, word had spread about her ability to read the ancient text. Arya nodded slowly, feeling the weight of that knowledge settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. For days, the doctor said grimly. Less, really. The ultimatum expires at sunset on the 4th day, which means tomorrow evening. The pack is tense. Tense. Another understatement. Arya could practically feel the anxiety radiating through the stone walls of the estate. An entire pack's future hanging in the balance, and she was the only one who could read the terms of their potential destruction. Rest now, Dr. Hartwell said, patting her hand with fatherly kindness. You'll need your strength for what's coming. He left her alone with her thoughts, and Arya found herself staring at the ceiling while memories of the past 2 days swirled through her mind. But these weren't memories of consciousness, they were dreams. Vivid, powerful dreams that felt more real than the waking world. Her mother had been there, clearer and more present than ever before. Not the distant, ethereal figure from her usual nighttime visions, but Elena Blackthorne as she'd been in life, strong, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her daughter. You are not a servant, Arya, her mother had said, taking Arya's hands in the dream and looking directly into her eyes. You are my daughter. You carry my blood, my knowledge, and my strength. It's time you remembered that. The dream Elena had shown her things, memories that Arya had buried so deep she'd forgotten they existed. Her parents hadn't been simple wolves killed by rogues. Her father had been a respected translator and scholar, fluent in dozens of ancient languages. Her mother had been his equal, a brilliant woman who'd taught linguistics at the Pax University before Arya was born. We taught you because we knew this day would come, Elena had explained, her dream voice heavy with sadness. We could feel the old powers stirring, the ancient conflicts rising again. We prepared you, little wolf, but then we were taken before we could explain why. Arya had learned in those dreams that her parents had been murdered not by random rogues, but by assassins sent to silence them. They discovered something in the old texts, something about bloodlines and prophecies that powerful wolves wanted kept secret. Their deaths had been ordered to protect that secret. But you survived, Elena had whispered, stroking Arya's hair as she'd done when Arya was small. You survived, and you carry everything we taught you. The knowledge lives in you, waiting to be remembered. And with it, the strength to stand up for yourself. The most powerful part of the dreams hadn't been the revelations about her past, though. It had been her mother's gentle but firm lessons about self-worth. You bow to no one unless you choose to, Elena had said, her voice ringing with conviction. You are not lesser because you serve. You are not worthless because others treat you poorly. You have value, Arya. You have power. And it's time you used both. Those words echoed in Arya's mind as she lay in the medical wing, feeling something fundamental shifting inside her chest. For 7 years, she'd made herself small and invisible, accepting cruelty and indifference as her due. She'd convinced herself she deserved nothing better because she had nothing to offer. But that wasn't true. It had never been true. The ancient languages flowing through her mind weren't just random dream knowledge. They were her inheritance, passed down from parents who'd died to protect what they'd learned. The ability to read texts that could start or stop wars wasn't a convenient accident, it was a skill born from years of hidden lessons and careful preparation. She was Elena Blackthorne's daughter. And Elena Blackthorne's daughter didn't cower. The medical wing door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, and Damon Blackwood strode into the room like an approaching storm. Dr. Hartwell followed close behind, his face creased with worry and frustration. Alpha, please, she's only just awakened. She needs more time too. Time is the one thing we don't have, Damon cut him off, his dark eyes fixed on Arya with laser intensity. Get out, doctor. Now. Dr. Hartwell looked like he wanted to argue, but alphas didn't make requests, they gave orders. He shot Arya an apologetic look and reluctantly left the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Suddenly, the medical wing felt much smaller. Damon approached her bed with the controlled movements of a predator, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon light. 2 days of stress had taken their toll on him. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. But none of that diminished the raw power radiating from him, or the barely contained fury that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. "Sit up," he commanded, his voice harsh with exhaustion and desperation. 2 days ago, Arya would have scrambled to obey. She would have pulled herself upright despite her weakness, kept her eyes downcast, and waited for his next order with trembling hands. The old Arya, the servant who'd learned to survive by becoming invisible, would never have dreamed of defying him. But the old Arya had never heard her mother's voice explaining exactly who she really was. Instead of sitting up, Arya turned her head on the pillow to look at him fully. Really look at him, not the quick, fearful glances she'd stolen over the years, but a direct, measuring stare that seemed to surprise him. "I said sit up," Damon repeated, his tone growing dangerous. Arya continued to study his face, noting the lines of stress around his eyes, the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He was afraid, she realized. Terrified, actually. His entire world was crumbling around him, and he was lashing out at the only person who might be able to save it. Understanding didn't make her feel sorry for him, though. It just made her see him more clearly. "I heard you," she said quietly. Damon's eyebrows shot up. In 7 years of service, she'd never failed to immediately obey a direct order. Her calm response threw him off balance, and he struggled to regain his footing. "Then do it. Get up and translate that letter. All of it. Right now." There it was, the arrogant demand, the assumption that she existed solely to serve his needs. The tone that said she was nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded when no longer useful. Her mother's voice whispered through her memory, "You are not a servant, Arya. You are my daughter." "No," she said simply. The single word hung in the air between them like a blade. Damon went completely still, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and rapidly building rage. "What did you just say to me?" Arya pushed herself up to a sitting position, moving slowly but deliberately. Her head still swam slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I said no." Damon's face flushed red, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise 10 degrees. "You said no? To me? To your alpha?" "Yes." The simplicity of her responses was clearly driving him toward a complete breakdown. He began to pace at the foot of her bed, his movements sharp and agitated. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he snarled. "Do you understand what defying an alpha means? I could have you exiled. I could have you killed. I could." "You could," Arya agreed calmly, "but you won't." That stopped him mid-pace. "I won't?" "No. Because I'm the only person in this pack who can read that letter, and you need me." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, his anger was replaced by something that might have been respect. Then the fury roared back, stronger than before. "Need you?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I don't need anyone, especially not some worthless servant girl who..." "I'm not worthless." The quiet certainty in her voice cut through his rant like a knife. Damon stared at her, seeing something in her face that hadn't been there before. Where once there had been fear and submission, now there was something else entirely. Dignity. Self-possession. Strength. "You've spent 7 years treating me like I'm nothing," Arya continued, her voice gaining power with each word. "Making me invisible, forcing me to accept scraps and cruelty as my due. But I'm not nothing, Alpha. I never was." Damon's hands clenched into fists. "You're my servant. You'll do as you're told or face the consequences." "Will I?" Arya tilted her head, studying him with new eyes. "Because it seems to me that you're the one facing consequences right now. For days until your pack burns, and you can't even read the terms of your own destruction." His face went white with rage, and for a moment she thought he might actually strike her. She could see him wrestling with the impulse, his whole body vibrating with barely controlled violence. But striking her wouldn't solve his problem. It wouldn't translate the letter. It wouldn't save his pack. And they both knew it. What do you want? The words came out like they were being torn from his throat. It was the first time in 7 years that he'd asked her what she wanted instead of simply telling her what to do. The first time he'd acknowledged that she might have desires and needs of her own. Arya considered the question seriously. What did she want? Freedom, certainly. Respect. The chance to live as something more than an invisible servant. But mostly, she wanted him to understand that she was a person, not a possession. I want you to ask me nicely, she said finally. Damon's jaw dropped. Ask you nicely? Please, she clarified. I want you to say please. The request was so simple, so basic, that it seemed to shock him more than outright defiance would have. For 7 years, he'd never said please to her. Never acknowledged her as worthy of basic courtesy. She was asking for the most fundamental recognition of her humanity, and he looked like she'd asked him to cut off his own arm. I don't say please to servants, he ground out. Then I suppose you don't really need my help after all. She settled back against the pillows and closed her eyes, dismissing him as effectively as he'd dismissed her countless times over the years. The silence that followed was electric with tension. You're bluffing, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Arya opened her eyes and met his gaze steadily. Am I? They stared at each other across the small room, two wills locked in a battle that would determine not just the fate of the letter, but the entire nature of their relationship going forward. Damon's face cycled through rage, disbelief, and something that might have been grudging admiration. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. You're not the same person who collapsed 2 days ago. No, Arya agreed quietly. I'm not. I'm the person I should have been all along. Damon studied her for a long moment, and she could practically see the calculations running through his mind. His pride warred with his desperation, his need to maintain dominance battling against his need for her help. In the end, necessity won. But barely. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. I'll ask nicely. But understand this, girl, when this crisis is over, when my pack is safe, you and I are going to have a very different conversation about respect and consequences. The threat was clear, but Arya felt no fear. Her mother's voice whispered through her mind, you bow to no one unless you choose to. When this crisis is over, she said calmly, I think you'll find that a lot of things are going to be different than you expect. Damon's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond to the challenge in her words. Instead, he moved closer to the bed, his massive frame towering over her. When he spoke, each word sounded like it was being pulled from him with pliers. Please, he said, the word dripping with reluctance and barely suppressed fury, translate the letter. Arya smiled, not the tremulous, fearful expression she'd worn as a servant, but something new. Something that held power and knowledge and the quiet satisfaction of a battle won. Now that, she said softly, wasn't so hard, was it? But even as she spoke the words, she could see the promise of retribution burning in his dark eyes. He would make her pay for this moment of defiance, for forcing him to bend his pride, for showing him that she was more than the invisible servant he'd taken for granted. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it made her smile wider. Let him try. She was Elena Blackthorne's daughter, and she was done being afraid. The real battle between them was just beginning. Chapter 4. The word, please, had barely left Damon's lips before his composure shattered completely. You think this is a game? His voice rose to a roar that rattled the medical wing windows. You think you can manipulate me with your pathetic demands for courtesy? Arya regarded him calmly from her hospital bed, her newfound strength like armor around her heart. I think you need my help more than I need yours. The simple truth of her statement hit him like a physical blow. His face cycled through shades of red as rage consumed what little restraint he had left. Help? He laughed, but the sound was sharp and bitter. You call holding my pack hostage help? You call threatening the lives of innocent wolves help? I'm not threatening anyone, Arya said quietly. I'm simply choosing not to be your victim anymore. Victim? Damon's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You've been fed, housed, and protected for 7 years. You've lived under my roof, eaten my food, been kept safe from the dangers of the world. And this is how you repay that generosity? Arya's calm facade flickered for the first time. Generosity? You call scraps from the kitchen generosity? You call sleeping on a straw pallet in a room barely large enough for storage generosity? You call 7 years of being treated like I'm invisible protection? You're alive, aren't you? Damon shot back. You could be dead in a ditch somewhere, or worse. Instead, you've had shelter and purpose. That's more than most orphans can claim. Purpose. Arya tasted the word like something bitter. Is that what you call it when you work someone 14 hours a day and pay them nothing? When you never acknowledge their existence except to bark orders? When you make them feel grateful for cruelty because it could always be worse? Her words struck home in ways Damon hadn't expected. For a moment, something that might have been guilt flickered across his features. But it was quickly consumed by renewed fury. Fine, he snarled. You want to play this game? Let's play. What do you want? Money? A better room? New clothes? Name your price, and let's end this charade. Arya studied his face, seeing the desperation beneath his anger. He still didn't understand. Still thought this was about transaction, about finding the right payment to secure her compliance. What do I want? She repeated softly. Yes. What do you want? Each word was bitten off with precision. Arya met his eyes directly, her gaze steady and unwavering. And then, deliberately, she said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Damon waited, his breathing growing more labored with each passing second. When it became clear she wasn't going to answer, his composure snapped entirely. Answer me, he bellowed, stepping closer to the bed. I asked you a question. Still, Arya remained silent. Not defiant silence, not angry silence, but something much more powerful, the silence of someone who refused to be commanded. You will tell me what you want, Damon growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. One way or another, you will give me what I need. Arya tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, with deliberate care, she lay back down on the pillows and closed her eyes. The dismissal was complete and devastating. Damon stared at her prone form, his chest heaving with frustrated rage. She looked so small lying there, so fragile. But there was nothing fragile about the steel in her spine or the quiet power radiating from her still form. You think you're strong, he said, his voice rising again. You think this little act of defiance makes you powerful? I could break you with my bare hands. I could have you thrown out of this pack to fend for yourself in the wilderness. I could. You could kill me, Arya said quietly, not opening her eyes. But then you'd never know what the rest of that letter says. And your pack would burn anyway. The truth of her words hit him like ice water. His threats were empty, and they both knew it. As long as she was the only one who could read the ancient text, she held all the cards. But Damon Blackwood hadn't become alpha by accepting defeat gracefully. Guards, he roared, storming toward the door. Guards. 2 burly pack members appeared within seconds, their faces tense with worry. Alpha? Take her to the basement cells, Damon commanded, not looking back at Arya. She wants to play games? Fine. Let's see how long her resolve lasts in the cold and dark. Arya's eyes snapped open, but she didn't move as the guards approached her bed. One of them, a grizzled warrior named Thompson, looked uncomfortable with the order. Alpha, she's just recovered from. Did I ask for your opinion? Damon's voice could have frozen hell itself. Take her to the cells. Now. The guards exchanged glances but didn't dare disobey. Thompson lifted Arya from the bed with surprising gentleness, while his partner gathered the thin hospital blanket around her shoulders. This won't break me, Arya said as they carried her past Damon toward the door. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. And when your pack burns because you were too proud to treat me like a human being, remember that you chose this. Damon's jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth grinding. We'll see. The basement cells of the Blackwood estate were a relic from darker times, when pack justice was swift and brutal. Cut into the stone foundation of the house, they were cold, damp, and designed to break the spirit of anyone unfortunate enough to be confined there. Arya had never seen them before, but she'd heard whispers from other servants. The narrow corridor lined with iron-barred cells. The constant drip of moisture from the stone ceiling. The way sound carried strangely in the underground space, making every footstep echo like thunder. They placed her in the cell at the far end of the corridor, as far from warmth and human contact as possible. The iron door clanged shut with a finality that might have terrified the servant girl she'd been just days ago. But Arya wasn't that girl anymore. She settled onto the thin straw pallet and pulled the hospital blanket around her shoulders, taking stock of her situation with the calm assessment her mother had taught her in dreams. Cold, but not freezing. Dark, but not completely lightless. A small window high in the wall let in a sliver of daylight. Uncomfortable, but survivable. Most importantly, she wasn't alone. Even in this place designed to break spirits, her mother's presence surrounded her like a warm embrace. Strength isn't about never falling down, Elena's voice whispered through her memory. It's about getting back up every time they try to keep you down. Above her, Arya could hear the muffled sounds of the pack house in crisis. Hurried footsteps. Raised voices. The constant undercurrent of fear that had infected the entire estate since the letter's arrival. Let them worry. Let them panic. She had chosen her path, and she would see it through to the end. But if Arya was calm in her cold cell, the same couldn't be said for the man who'd put her there. Damon paced his study like a caged wolf, his mind racing with desperate calculations. 3 days. They had 3 days left before the Crimson Fang Pack's deadline, and he was no closer to a solution than he'd been a week ago. The letter lay on his desk, its ancient symbols mocking him with their incomprehensible meaning. Somewhere in those twisted characters lay the key to his pack's survival, and the only person who could unlock it was rotting in his basement out of sheer spite. A sharp knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he growled. His father entered, followed by Marcus and several other senior pack members. The older man's face was grim, aged beyond his years by stress and worry. "We need to talk," his father said without preamble. Damon gestured to the chairs arranged around his desk, but nobody sat. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. "The pack is asking questions," Marcus said bluntly. "About your leadership. About your ability to handle this crisis." "Let them ask," Damon replied coldly. "I'm still their alpha." "Are you?" His father's question was quiet but devastating. "Because right now, it looks like a servant girl has more power over our fate than you do." Damon's hands clenched into fists. "That servant girl is the key to reading the letter. Once she breaks." "Once she breaks?" Marcus interrupted with a harsh laugh. "Damon, it's been 3 days. She's shown no signs of breaking. If anything, her defiance seems to be getting stronger." "Then we haven't tried hard enough," Damon snarled. "Haven't tried hard enough?" His father's voice rose with incredulity. "Son, you've locked an injured girl in the basement cells over a translation. How exactly do you propose to try harder, without crossing lines that will destroy your reputation entirely?" "My reputation?" Damon laughed bitterly. "In 3 days, reputation won't matter. We'll all be dead. And whose fault is that?" The question came from Elena Blackwood, Damon's younger sister, who had been silent until now. "You could have asked her nicely from the beginning. You could have offered her a reward instead of threats. But no, you had to turn it into a battle of wills with someone who has nothing left to lose." "She's a servant," Damon said through gritted teeth. "Servants don't make demands of their alphas." "She's a person," Elena shot back. "A person you've treated terribly for 7 years. And now you're surprised that she won't help you?" "Enough." Damon's father's voice cut through the argument like a blade. The question isn't who's to blame. The question is what we do now. Marcus leaned forward, his expression calculating. We could try torture. Real torture, not just confinement. If we hurt her enough. No. The refusal came from Damon himself, surprising everyone in the room. We don't torture people for information. That's not who we are. Then what? Marcus spread his hands in frustration. Because sitting here debating morality while our enemies sharpen their claws isn't exactly a winning strategy. Before anyone could answer, another knock echoed through the study. This time it was a young pack member, his face pale with fear. Alpha, he stammered. There's another message. From the Crimson Fang pack. The room went dead silent. Damon felt his heart sink into his stomach as the messenger handed him a second letter. This one wasn't sealed with elaborate wax, it was tied with a strip of red leather that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Damon's hands shook as he unfolded the parchment. The symbols were different this time, cruder, more aggressive. But they were still written in the same ancient dialect that only one person in his pack could read. What does it say? His father asked quietly. Damon stared at the incomprehensible text, feeling his world crumble around him. I don't know. You don't know? Marcus's voice was sharp with disbelief. Damon, we need to know what. I said I don't know. Damon roared, slamming the letter down on his desk. I can't read it. None of us can read it. The only person who can translate this is locked in my basement because she won't do what she's told. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For the first time since becoming Alpha, Damon had openly acknowledged his helplessness in front of his inner circle. Then maybe, his father said quietly, it's time to reconsider your approach. You want me to give in to her demands? Damon's voice was incredulous. You want me to show weakness in front of a servant? I want you to save our pack, his father replied firmly. Whatever that takes. Elena stepped forward, her expression sympathetic but determined. Damon, what if she's not trying to manipulate you? What if she's just tired of being treated like dirt? Then she should have thought of that before she decided to play games with people's lives, Damon snapped. Like you've been playing games with hers for 7 years? Elena shot back. The accusation hit harder than Damon expected. For a moment, he saw himself through his sister's eyes, a powerful man who'd spent years crushing someone weaker simply because he could. But admitting that would mean admitting he'd been wrong. And Damon Blackwood didn't admit weakness. 3 days, he said finally, his voice cold and final. She has 3 days to come to her senses. After that, it won't matter what either letter says. The meeting dissolved after that, pack members filing out with worried expressions and hushed conversations. But Damon barely noticed. He was staring at the 2 letters on his desk, feeling the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical thing. Somewhere below his feet, in the cold darkness of the basement cells, lay the key to his salvation. And she was slipping further away from his grasp with each passing hour. Meanwhile, in her cell, Arya had settled into a routine that would have impressed a monk with its discipline. She woke each morning to her mother's voice in dreams, receiving not just comfort but practical advice about surviving confinement. She spent her days in meditation and mental exercises, keeping her mind sharp and her resolve steady. The guards brought her food twice a day, thin gruel and stale bread that would have once seemed like insults. Now she ate them gratefully, understanding that strength came from accepting what was offered while never accepting what was unacceptable. On the second day, Thompson the guard lingered after delivering her evening meal. Miss, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. The pack, they're scared. Really scared. That second letter has everyone talking about evacuation plans. Arya looked up at him through the bars, seeing genuine concern in his weathered face. Are you asking me to give in? Thompson was quiet for a long moment. I'm asking if there's any way to end this that doesn't result in everyone I care about dying. It was a fair question, and Arya considered it seriously before responding. There is. But it requires your Alpha to understand that I'm not his property. And if he never understands that? Arya met his eyes steadily. Then I suppose we'll all find out together what the Crimson Fang pack really wants. Thompson nodded slowly and walked away, leaving Arya alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that time was running out for all of them. Above her, she could hear the pack house settling into another restless night. In 3 days, everything would change. The only question was whether Damon Blackwood would find his pride more important than his people's lives. In her dreams that night, her mother's voice was sad but proud. "Hold fast, little wolf. The hardest part is yet to come." But Arya was ready. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire life, even if she hadn't known it. The question wasn't whether she would break. The question was whether Damon would bend before it was too late for all of them. Chapter 5. The 6th day dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of what was to come. Damon stood at his study window, watching the sun struggle to break through the oppressive sky, and felt the weight of his failures crushing down on him like a physical thing. 24 hours. Less than a day before the Crimson Fang pack's deadline expired, and he was no closer to a solution than he'd been a week ago. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of voices from the emergency pack meeting that had been called for dawn. His father, his sister, Marcus, and a dozen other senior members had gathered to discuss what everyone was too polite to say aloud, whether Damon Blackwood was fit to lead them through this crisis. "The evacuation plans are ready," Marcus was saying, his voice carefully neutral. "We can have the non-combatants move to the mountain safe houses within 6 hours if necessary." "And abandon our territory?" Elena's voice was sharp with disbelief. "This pack has held this land for 4 generations. We don't run. We don't commit suicide either," Marcus shot back. "And staying here without knowing what we're facing is exactly that." Damon continued staring out the window, letting their voices wash over him like white noise. They were right to be afraid. Right to question his leadership. Right to prepare for the worst. But hearing it spoken aloud felt like daggers in his chest. "What about the girl?" someone asked. Damon didn't turn to see who it was. "Still in the cells," Marcus replied grimly. 5 days now, and no sign of breaking. "If anything, she seems more resolved than ever." "Then perhaps," came his father's measured voice, "it's time to try a different approach." That got Damon's attention. He turned from the window to find all eyes in the room fixed on him with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed frustration. "A different approach," Damon repeated slowly. His father nodded, his lined face grave with concern. "Son, your pride is going to get us all killed." The words hit like a slap across the face. "My pride?" "Yes, your pride." The older man stood up from his chair, his posture still commanding despite his age. "You've turned this into a battle of wills with someone who has nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, our deadline shrinks by the hour." "She's a servant," Damon said through gritted teeth, falling back on the argument that had sustained him through 5 days of mounting pressure. "Servants don't dictate terms to their alphas." "She's not acting like a servant anymore," Elena said quietly. "And maybe that's because you never treated her like a person to begin with." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Damon felt his temper rising, the familiar rage that had always been his shield against criticism and doubt. "Don't lecture me about." "About what?" His father's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "About leadership? About responsibility? About putting the pack's needs before your own ego?" Damon's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Everything I've done has been for this pack." "Really?" Marcus stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're willing to let hundreds of wolves die rather than admit you made a mistake." "I don't make mistakes," Damon snarled. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room stared at him with expressions of disbelief, pity, or barely concealed anger. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence with a laugh that held no humor. "You don't make mistakes," he repeated. "Damon, this entire situation is a mistake. You could have handled this diplomatically from the beginning. You could have offered the girl incentives instead of threats. You could have." I could have shown weakness, Damon finished coldly. I could have set a precedent that any servant can make demands of their alpha and expect to be rewarded for it. You could have saved our pack, his father said quietly. And that should matter more than your reputation. The word struck deeper than any physical blow could have. Damon stared at his father, the man who had taught him everything about leadership, about strength, about the responsibilities of being alpha, and saw disappointment in those familiar eyes. You think I should give in to her, Damon said. It wasn't a question. I think, his father replied carefully, that sometimes the strongest thing an alpha can do is admit when he's wrong. And if I'm not wrong? If giving in to her demands undermines my authority permanently? Marcus stepped forward again, his expression grim. If you don't give in to her demands, there won't be any authority left to undermine. We'll all be dead. The brutal honesty of the statement cut through Damon's defenses like they were made of paper. For the first time since this crisis began, he was forced to confront the possibility that his approach had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Before he could respond, another knock echoed through the study. The same young messenger from the day before entered, his face even paler than before. Alpha, he stammered, there's been a development. Damon's blood turned to ice in his veins. What kind of development? Scouts report movement on our eastern border. A large force. The Crimson Fang pack is mobilizing. The room erupted in alarmed voices, but Damon barely heard them. The reality of their situation crashed over him like a cold wave. This wasn't just about ultimatums and threats anymore. Their enemies were preparing for war. How large a force, his father asked, his alpha training taking over despite his age. At least 200 fighters, sir. Maybe more. They're not trying to hide their movements. They want us to see them, Marcus realized grimly. They want us to know we're outmatched. Damon closed his eyes and tried to think past the panic clawing at his chest. 200 fighters against their pack of maybe 80 combat-ready wolves. Even if they called in their allies, the numbers were impossible. Unless they knew what the letters said. Unless they understood what the Crimson Fang pack really wanted. Unless they could find some way to negotiate from a position of knowledge rather than ignorance. How long until they reach our territory? Damon asked, his voice hollow. At their current pace? 6 hours, maybe less. 6 hours to midnight. 6 hours until the deadline expired and their world ended in fire and blood. Sir, the messenger continued hesitantly, there's something else. The advanced scouts, they're carrying white flags. That got everyone's attention. White flags meant they wanted to talk, not fight. But talk about what? They're coming to negotiate, Elena breathed. Which means they expect us to know what their terms are. All eyes turned to Damon, and he felt the weight of their expectations like stones in his chest. They were looking to him for leadership, for answers, for some miracle that would save them all. And he had nothing to give them except pride and stubbornness. Get out, he said quietly. Damon, his father began. Get out. The roar echoed through the study like thunder. All of you. Leave me alone. The room emptied quickly, pack members filing out with worried glances and hushed whispers. Only his father lingered at the door, his expression sad but understanding. Son, he said gently, pride is a luxury we can't afford anymore. Then he was gone, leaving Damon alone with his failures and the ticking clock of their approaching doom. For several minutes, Damon simply stood in the empty study, staring at the 2 letters that had destroyed his world. The ancient symbols seemed to mock him with their incomprehensible meaning. Somewhere in those twisted characters lay the key to everything, the Crimson Fang pack's true intentions, their terms for peace, perhaps even a way to avoid the coming slaughter. And the only person who could unlock that mystery was sitting in his basement cells, sustained by a strength he'd never bothered to recognize. The admission came slowly, like pulling a splinter from an infected wound. He had been wrong. Not just tactically wrong, but fundamentally, morally wrong. He'd treated Arya like property for 7 years, and when she'd finally found the courage to demand basic human dignity, he'd responded with more cruelty. His pride had blinded him to everything except his own wounded ego. And now that pride was going to cost him everything that mattered. The clock on his desk chimed 11 times, marking the passing of another hour. 5 hours until the deadline. 5 hours until his pack faced annihilation because he'd been too stubborn to say he was sorry. With movements that felt like they belonged to someone else, Damon walked to his desk and pulled out a leather portfolio. Inside were his financial documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds. His entire annual income laid out in neat columns of numbers. $300 million. More money than most people saw in a lifetime. More money than Arya could probably even comprehend. If money was what it took to break this deadlock, then money she would have. The basement stairs felt steeper than usual as Damon descended into the cold darkness below. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the stone corridor, announcing his approach to the woman who held his fate in her hands. He found her sitting cross-legged on her thin pallet, her back straight and her eyes closed in what looked like meditation. The hospital blanket was wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak, and despite 5 days of imprisonment, there was something almost regal about her posture. She opened her eyes as he approached, meeting his gaze with the same calm strength she'd shown in the medical wing. No fear. No submission. Just quiet dignity in the face of his power. "You're early," she said softly. "I expected you'd wait until the last possible moment." Damon gripped the iron bars of her cell, feeling their coldness bite into his palms. "The Crimson Fang pack is mobilizing. They'll be at our borders in 5 hours." Arya nodded as if this wasn't surprising news. "They're coming to negotiate." "How did you?" Damon stopped himself. Of course she knew. She'd read both letters. She understood what was happening while he'd been stumbling around blind. "What do they want?" he asked, hating how desperate he sounded. Arya tilted her head, studying his face with those clear, intelligent eyes. "You're still trying to command me." The observation hit him like a physical blow. Even now, even facing the destruction of everything he'd built, he couldn't let go of the need to be in control. "You're right," he said, the admission scraping his throat raw. "I am." They stared at each other through the bars for a long moment, predator and prey roles reversed in ways that made Damon's chest tight with something that might have been respect. "I'll make you a deal," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Arya's eyebrows rose slightly. "A deal?" Damon pulled out the leather portfolio, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. "Translate both letters completely. Tell me everything they say, help me negotiate with the Crimson Fang pack, and I'll give you my entire annual salary." He held up the financial documents, letting her see the numbers that represented his wealth. $300 million. Tax-free. You'll never have to serve anyone again. You can go anywhere, do anything, be anyone you want to be. Arya stared at the papers in his hands, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Damon thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or calculation. "Your entire salary," she repeated slowly. "Yes. And I'd be free to leave after?" "Yes. No strings attached. No demands for loyalty or future service." "None." The word came out hoarse with desperation. "Just help me save my pack, and you can disappear forever if that's what you want." Arya was quiet for so long that Damon began to worry she would refuse even this. $300 million was more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, but maybe money wasn't what she wanted. Maybe this had never been about compensation at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Why now? Why this offer instead of all the threats and demands?" Damon looked at her sitting there in her cold cell, wrapped in a thin blanket, possessing nothing but the knowledge in her head and the strength in her heart. And for the first time in 7 years, he really saw her. Not a servant. Not a tool to be used. Not an obstacle to his will. A person. A woman who'd survived tragedy and abuse and years of invisibility, who'd found the courage to stand up for herself when it mattered most. A woman who held the power to save or damn his entire world, and who'd earned that power through suffering he'd been too proud to acknowledge. Because, he said, his voice breaking slightly, you were right. About everything. I've treated you terribly, and I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Arya's eyes widened slightly, as if she'd never expected to hear those words from him. You're sorry, she repeated. Yes. The word came easier the second time. I'm sorry for 7 years of cruelty. I'm sorry for treating you like you were worthless. I'm sorry for putting my pride before my pack's safety. And I'm sorry it took the threat of losing everything to make me see what I'd become. Tears gathered in Arya's eyes, but she blinked them back before they could fall. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and Damon saw the young woman beneath the armor of dignity she'd built around herself. You really mean that, she said. It wasn't a question. I mean it. Damon pressed closer to the bars, willing her to see the sincerity in his face. I know I don't deserve your help. I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I've put you through. But my pack, there are children up there, Arya. Innocent people who will die because of my mistakes. Arya studied his face for what felt like an eternity, looking for lies or manipulation or the calculation that had always driven their interactions before. Instead, she saw something she'd never seen in Damon Blackwood's eyes, genuine remorse. And beneath that, something else. Fear. Not for himself, but for his people. $300 million, she said finally. Yes. And an apology. Yes. And the promise that I can leave when this is over. Yes. His voice was hoarse with desperate hope. Arya rose from her pallet with fluid grace, moving to stand directly in front of the cell door. They were separated by mere inches of iron and air, close enough that Damon could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. I accept your deal, she said quietly. The relief that flooded through Damon was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you. Arya nodded once, then stepped back as he fumbled for the keys to her cell. But as the lock clicked open and the door swung wide, she held up one hand to stop him from entering. Before we go upstairs, she said, her voice carrying a note of warning, you need to understand something. What's in those letters, it's going to change everything. Are you prepared for that? Damon met her gaze steadily, seeing the gravity in her expression. I'm prepared for anything that keeps my pack alive. Arya nodded slowly, then walked past him toward the stairs. We'll see. As they climbed toward the light above, neither of them spoke. But both understood that they were ascending toward a future that would be nothing like the past they were leaving behind in the darkness below. The price of pride had been paid in full. Now came the reckoning. Chapter 6. The study felt different as Arya entered it for the second time in a week, smaller somehow, as if her newfound strength had shifted the very dimensions of the space. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, and for a moment she allowed herself to savor the warmth on her face after 5 days of basement cold. Damon followed close behind her, his movements sharp with nervous energy. The emergency pack meeting had been hastily reconvened, and now a dozen anxious faces turned toward them as they entered. Arya could feel the weight of their stares, but for the first time in 7 years, she didn't shrink from the attention. The letters, Damon said without preamble, gesturing toward his desk where both pieces of parchment lay waiting. Everything they say. Leave nothing out. Arya nodded and approached the desk, her fingers hovering over the ancient symbols that had started this entire crisis. She could feel her mother's presence strongly now, Elena's voice whispering encouragement and guidance as she prepared to unlock secrets that could save or damn them all. Before I begin, she said, looking around the room at the assembled pack leaders, you should know that what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear. Marcus stepped forward, his expression grim. How difficult? The kind of difficult that changes everything you thought you knew about this conflict, Arya replied quietly. She picked up the first letter, the one that had started everything, and felt the familiar tingle of recognition as her mother's teachings flowed through her mind. The ancient symbols resolved into meaning like fog clearing from glass. The first letter, she began, her voice steady and clear, is not just an ultimatum. It's an accusation. Damon's father leaned forward in his chair. What kind of accusation? Aria's eyes moved across the text, her mother's voice guiding her through nuances of meaning that went far beyond simple translation. They're claiming that Alpha Damon has broken the Treaty of Silver Moon. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several pack members began talking at once, their voices raised in confusion and alarm. That's impossible, Marcus protested. The Treaty of Silver Moon was signed 50 years ago. It guarantees territorial boundaries between all northern packs. What exactly are they claiming he did? Damon's father asked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Arya continued reading, her expression growing more grave with each line. They say that 3 months ago, Damon's hunting parties crossed into Crimson Fang territory and killed 17 of their wolves. They claim this was an act of war that voided the treaty. That's a lie, Damon snarled, his hands clenching into fists. My hunting parties have never crossed territorial boundaries. I'd stake my life on it. Would you? Arya asked quietly, looking up from the letter. Because according to this, they have proof. Witnesses. Evidence that your hunters not only crossed the boundary but did so on your direct orders. The study fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Damon stared at Arya with an expression that cycled through confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. That's impossible, he said again, but his voice lacked conviction. Arya set down the first letter and picked up the second, the one that had arrived just days ago. The second letter escalates their demands. Originally, they wanted you to step down as Alpha and submit to Crimson Fang authority. Now. She paused, reading ahead with growing alarm. Now what? Elena demanded. Now they want the pact dissolved entirely. All territory surrendered. All wolves absorbed into their pack structure or eliminated. The words hit the room like physical blows. Someone gasped. Someone else cursed. Damon's face went white as paper. They're planning genocide, he breathed. Not planning, Arya corrected grimly. Implementing. According to this, they've already received approval from the Northern Pack Council. The attack begins at sunset whether you surrender or not. Marcus stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. The council approved this? Based on what evidence? Arya looked back at the letter, her mother's voice helping her parse the complex political language. Testimony from 3 witnesses who claimed to have seen the border incursion. Physical evidence, fur samples and scent markers. And... She paused, reading more carefully. A confession. A confession from who? Damon demanded. Arya met his eyes directly. From you, apparently. Or someone claiming to be you. They have documents bearing your signature admitting to ordering the attack. The silence that followed was deafening. Damon stared at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. I never signed any confession. I never ordered any attack. I don't even know what border incursion they're talking about. Then someone has gone to great lengths to frame you, Arya said quietly. The question is who, and why. Before anyone could respond, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the hallway. A scout burst through the study doors, his face flushed with exertion and fear. Alpha, he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. The Crimson Fang forces, they're not just mobilizing. They're already here. 2 miles from our eastern border and closing fast. Damon's training kicked in immediately. How many? At least 300. Maybe more. And Alpha. The scout swallowed hard. They're carrying silver weapons. Silver weapons meant this wasn't a territorial dispute or a negotiation. Silver weapons meant extermination. How long do we have? Marcus asked, his beta instincts taking over. 30 minutes. Maybe less. The room erupted in controlled chaos as pack leaders began barking orders and planning defensive strategies. But Arya remained focused on the letters, her mind racing as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "There's more." Everyone turned to look at her, and she could see the desperate hope in their eyes. Hope that she'd found some loophole, some diplomatic solution that could save them all. The second letter mentions a time frame for the original border incident. March 15th, approximately 11 p.m. Damon's father straightened in his chair. March 15th? But that's when. When I was in the capital, Damon finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. I was at the Northern Pack Assembly. Hundreds of witnesses can verify that. Then whoever ordered that hunting party, Marcus said grimly, they did it in your name while you were gone. Arya nodded, still reading. And according to this, the hunters were led by someone claiming to be acting on direct alpha orders. Someone with intimate knowledge of pack protocols and territorial boundaries. The implications hung in the air like poison. Someone within their own pack had betrayed them. Someone close enough to Damon to know his schedules, his authority codes, his territorial maps. We'll deal with the traitor later, Damon said, his voice hard as steel. Right now, we need to survive the next hour. But Arya held up her hand, her eyes still fixed on the second letter. There's something else. A clause near the end that I almost missed. She read in silence for several moments, her expression shifting from concentration to surprise to something that might have been hope. What is it? Elena asked. An out, Arya said softly. They've left themselves an out. She looked up at the assembled pack leaders, seeing the desperate attention focused on her words. The Treaty of Silver Moon has a provision for disputes involving false accusations. If evidence can be presented that the accused party was framed, and if the real perpetrator can be identified and surrendered for justice, then the original treaty remains in force. So if we can prove Damon was framed, Marcus began. And deliver the real traitor, Arya finished, then the Crimson Fang Pack has to honor the original territorial agreements. Hope bloomed in several faces around the room, but Damon remained focused on practicalities. That's all well and good, but we have 30 minutes before they attack. Even if we identify the traitor, how do we prove Damon's innocence and communicate it to their war chief before the killing starts? Arya smiled for the first time since this crisis began. Because the second letter also includes detailed instructions for a formal challenge under treaty law. If presented correctly, they have to honor a temporary ceasefire while evidence is reviewed. She looked around the room, seeing new determination replacing despair in the faces of the pack leaders. I can help you draft the challenge documents. I know the proper protocols, the formal language required. But you'll need to identify your traitor quickly. That won't be hard, Marcus said grimly. There are only 3 people who had access to Alpha Authority codes while Damon was at the assembly. He began naming names, and Arya watched as the pieces of the conspiracy fell into place. By the time the scout returned with news that the enemy forces had reached their borders, they had their traitor identified and a plan in motion. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Documents were drafted in the proper ceremonial language. Evidence was gathered. The traitor, an ambitious young wolf named Connor who'd hoped to seize power during the chaos, was captured and confessed under pressure. When the Crimson Fang war chief arrived under his white flag of truce, Damon was ready with a formal challenge presentation that stopped the attack cold. The treaty protocols were followed. Evidence was presented. And as the sun set on what should have been the day of the pack's destruction, the threat was neutralized entirely. The Crimson Fang Pack, faced with clear evidence of their mistake and the surrender of the real perpetrator, withdrew their forces and renewed the territorial agreements. Connor was handed over for justice under pack law, and the crisis that had nearly destroyed them was over. As the last of the enemy forces disappeared into the darkness, Damon found himself back in his study with Arya, both of them exhausted but alive. You saved us, he said quietly. All of us. Arya nodded, too tired for modesty. Your $300 million bought you excellent translation services. Damon moved to his desk and pulled out a leather portfolio, different from the one he'd shown her in the cell, this one containing transfer documents and bank authorizations. A deal is a deal, he said, signing papers with swift strokes. The money is yours, as promised. He handed her the documents that made her one of the wealthiest women in the supernatural world. $300 million. More money than she could spend in several lifetimes. Enough to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone she wanted to be. Thank you, she said simply, accepting the papers that represented her freedom. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Then Damon cleared his throat, his expression shifting to something that might have been nervousness. I have a proposition for you, he said. Arya looked up from the financial documents, noting the change in his tone. What kind of proposition? Stay. The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended, and he tried again with more control. I mean, I'd like to offer you a position. A permanent position as my chief diplomatic advisor and translator. He gestured toward the letters that had nearly destroyed them. Today proved that ancient languages and old treaties are more important than I realized. Having someone with your skills on my staff would be invaluable. Arya tilted her head, studying his face. What kind of position are we talking about? High-ranking. Significant salary beyond what I've already given you. Your own quarters in the main house, not the servants' wing. Full authority over diplomatic correspondence and treaty negotiations. He paused, then added, you'd be answering directly to me, but as an advisor, not a servant. It was a generous offer. More than generous, it was extraordinary. A servant girl elevated to one of the highest positions in the pack hierarchy. Security, prestige, the chance to use her skills in meaningful ways. Everything she should want. Arya considered it seriously, turning the offer over in her mind like a jewel examined for flaws. On the surface, it was perfect. But underneath. I appreciate the offer, she said finally. Truly. But I'm going to decline. Damon blinked, clearly not having expected that response. Decline? But, why? The salary alone would be more than most pack advisors make in a decade. It's not about money. Arya folded the transfer documents carefully and tucked them into her pocket. I've been in service to this pack for 7 years. I've never had the chance to discover who I am when I'm not defined by my usefulness to others. But you'd be valued here. Respected. You've proven yourself invaluable. Invaluable to you, Arya corrected gently. But what about invaluable to myself? Damon stared at her with growing frustration. You're throwing away an incredible opportunity. Do you have any idea how rare it is for someone to rise from servant to advisor? How many people would kill for the chance I'm offering you? I'm sure they would. But I'm not them. The frustration in Damon's expression was shifting towards something more familiar, anger. The old patterns reasserting themselves as he faced unexpected resistance to his will. So what? You're just going to disappear? Take the money and run off to live some fantasy life where you don't have to answer to anyone? Something like that, Arya said calmly. That's incredibly selfish. His voice was rising now, the careful control he'd maintained since their basement confrontation beginning to crack. You have skills this pack needs. Abilities that could save lives. And you're going to waste them on, what? Self-indulgence? Arya looked at him for a long moment, seeing the anger building in his face, the familiar signs of an alpha who wasn't getting his way. A week ago, that expression would have sent her scrambling to appease him. Now, it just made her sad. I'm going to waste them on figuring out who I am when I'm not afraid, she said quietly. On discovering what I want when I'm not focused on survival. On learning what it feels like to make choices based on my own desires instead of other people's needs. That's not how responsibility works, Damon snapped. We all have obligations to our communities, our families. My family is dead, Arya interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. My community is the pack that treated me like furniture for 7 years. I don't owe anyone anything anymore. Damon's face flushed red with frustration and emerging rage. After everything I've done for you. After everything you've done for yourself, Arya corrected. You didn't save me from the basement out of kindness, Damon. You saved me because you needed me. And you're not offering me this position out of generosity. You're offering it because you want to keep control over a useful asset. The accusation hit him like a slap. That's not true. Isn't it? Arya moved toward the study door, her movements unhurried despite the tension crackling in the air. If it was really about respecting my skills and valuing my contributions, you would have offered me choices. Instead, you presented me with a single option that happens to serve your needs perfectly. She paused at the threshold, looking back at him with something that might have been pity. I spent 7 years being told that serving your family was the highest honor I could aspire to. But you know what I realized during my time in that cell? Honor means nothing if it's forced. Respect means nothing if it's conditional. And value means nothing if it's defined by someone else. Damon took a step toward her, his face dark with the rage that had always been his default response to defiance. You can't just walk away. I won't let you. You won't let me? Arya's eyebrows rose slightly. And how exactly do you plan to stop me? Lock me in the basement again? Threaten me with exile? Take back the money you already gave me? The questions hung in the air like challenges, and Damon realized with growing frustration that he had no good answers. She was right, he had no power over her anymore. No leverage. No authority she was bound to respect. I could, he began, then stopped, recognizing the futility of threats against someone who had nothing left to lose. Arya smiled sadly. You could try. But we both know that everything you could do to me, you've already done. And I survived it all. What's left that could possibly frighten me? The truth of her words settled over him like cold water. She had endured his worst and emerged stronger. There was nothing left in his arsenal that could touch her. So that's it, he asked, his voice hollow with defeat. You're just leaving? I'm just leaving, she confirmed. But Damon, for what it's worth, I think you'll be a better alpha now. What happened this week taught you things about leadership that you needed to learn. Use those lessons. She turned to go, then paused for one final moment. And find yourself a diplomatic advisor who wants to be here. Someone who chooses to serve rather than being forced into it. You'll get better counsel from someone who has actual choices. With that, she walked out of his study and out of his life, leaving Damon alone with his rage and the dawning realization that all his power meant nothing against someone who had finally learned her own worth. For the first time in his life, Alpha Damon Blackwood had been defeated not by superior strength or cunning strategy, but by a servant girl who had simply refused to stay beaten. And as her footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing fainter with each step, he understood that some victories were hollow and some defeats were necessary. The real question was what he would choose to do with the lessons she'd taught him. Outside, dawn was breaking over a pack that had survived the night, led by an alpha who was finally beginning to understand the difference between power and strength. Chapter 7. The cottage sat on a hill overlooking a valley painted in shades of gold and green, with wildflowers dancing in the morning breeze and a stream that sang soft songs as it wound through the meadow below. For the first time in 7 years, Arya woke to sunlight streaming through windows that belonged to her. No bells summoning her to kitchen duty. No hushed whispers of fear echoing through stone corridors. No careful calculations about which routes through the house would help her avoid an alpha's unpredictable temper. Just silence. Beautiful, peaceful silence. She stretched in her own bed, a real bed with soft sheets and more pillows than one person could possibly need, and smiled at the ceiling that belonged to no one but her. 3 weeks had passed since she'd walked out of the Blackwood estate, and she was still adjusting to the radical concept of freedom. The small town of Millbrook was everything the Pack estate hadn't been. Quiet streets where people nodded good morning instead of averting their eyes. A coffee shop where the owner remembered her name and her preference for honey instead of sugar. A bookstore with a reading nook by the window where she could spend entire afternoons lost in stories about other people's adventures. Simple pleasures. Human pleasures. The kind of ordinary joys she'd never imagined could feel so extraordinary. She'd bought the cottage with cash, explaining to the curious real estate agent that she'd come into an inheritance. It wasn't entirely a lie. The $300 million did feel like a gift from beyond, even if it had come from Damon's desperation rather than a deceased relative's generosity. The cottage itself was modest by any reasonable standard. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people, and a living room dominated by a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in years. But after sleeping on a straw pallet in a room the size of a closet, it felt like a palace. More importantly, it felt like home. Arya made herself coffee in her own kitchen, using her own dishes, and carried the steaming mug out to the small porch that overlooked the valley. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and she wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the simple pleasure of choosing how to spend her day wash over her. She could go into town and browse the antique shops. She could work in the small garden she'd started behind the cottage. She could read. She could take a nap. She could do absolutely nothing at all. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. For 7 years, every moment of her existence had been dictated by others. Now, faced with infinite possibilities, she sometimes felt paralyzed by choice. What did she want to do? What did she enjoy? Who was Arya when she wasn't defined by her function in someone else's life? The answers came slowly, like flowers blooming after a long winter. She discovered that she loved gardening, the feel of earth between her fingers and the satisfaction of nurturing something from seed to flower. She found that she enjoyed cooking for herself, experimenting with recipes and flavors without worrying about pleasing demanding palates. Most surprisingly, she learned that she liked being alone. After years of constant service and hypervigilance, solitude felt like a luxury beyond price. Her mother came to her in dreams still, but the conversations had changed. Instead of urgent lessons about ancient languages or warnings about coming trials, Elena spoke about smaller things. How to plant lavender. Which books might ease a restless heart. The importance of learning to be content with oneself before seeking contentment with others. You're blooming, little wolf, her mother had said just the night before. I can see it in your dreams. You're becoming who you were always meant to be. Arya sipped her coffee and thought about that conversation as she watched the sun climb higher over the valley. She was changing, that much was undeniable. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in the pack house was slowly fading, replaced by something she was just learning to recognize as peace. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, she found her thoughts drifting back to the estate she'd left behind. Not with longing. She had no desire to return to that life, but with curiosity. How was the pack adjusting to the aftermath of the crisis? Had they found a new diplomatic advisor? Was Damon? She stopped herself before completing that thought. What Damon was doing was no longer her concern. She'd made her choice, and he would have to make his own choices about the kind of leader he wanted to be. Still, she couldn't help wondering. 50 miles away, in the study where she'd spent the most pivotal moments of her transformation, Damon sat staring at correspondence that should have held his complete attention. Trade agreements. Territorial dispute reports. Letters from other pack leaders requesting his input on various matters. All of it felt hollow. Important, yes. Necessary for the smooth functioning of his pack. But somehow lacking the urgency and meaning that used to drive him through 14-hour workdays. Marcus knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit that would have infuriated Damon a month ago. Now, he barely looked up from the papers spread across his desk. The territorial survey reports are in, Marcus announced, settling into one of the leather chairs facing the desk. Clean boundaries all around. No disputes, no encroachments. The Connor incident seems to have reminded everyone that treaty violations have serious consequences. Damon nodded absently, signing a document without really reading it. Good. Marcus studied his alpha's face with growing concern. For 3 weeks, ever since Arya's departure, Damon had been different. Not angry, which was perhaps the most unsettling change of all. The explosive temper that had defined his leadership style seemed to have simply evaporated, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm that worried everyone around him. Damon, Marcus said carefully, when was the last time you left this study? I left yesterday. Had dinner with the family. I mean really left. Gone for a run. Visited the training grounds. Interacted with pack members who aren't required to bring you paperwork. Damon finally looked up, his dark eyes focusing on his beta with visible effort. Why would I do that? The question was so unlike the Damon that Marcus had known for years that it left him momentarily speechless. The old Damon had been a constant presence throughout the pack territory, his need for control driving him to personally oversee everything from combat training to kitchen inventory. Because you're the alpha, Marcus said finally. Because people need to see you. Because leadership isn't just about signing papers and making decisions from behind a desk. Isn't it? Damon set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, looking genuinely curious about the answer. The pack is running smoothly. No conflicts, no complaints, no crises. What more do they need from me? Marcus felt a chill of genuine alarm. This wasn't the behavior of a leader who'd found inner peace. This was the behavior of someone who'd lost his sense of purpose entirely. They need to know you care about them as more than just names on reports, Marcus said bluntly. They need to see that their alpha is invested in their daily lives, not just their strategic value. Ah. Damon nodded as if this were a new and interesting concept. Like she said. Like who said? Arya. The name came out quietly, almost reverently. She said I treated people like assets instead of individuals. That I valued them for their usefulness rather than their humanity. Marcus blinked in surprise. In 3 weeks, this was the first time Damon had mentioned their former servant by name. You've been thinking about her. I think about her constantly. The admission came out matter-of-factly, as if Damon were commenting on the weather. About what she said. About how she looked at me those last few days. About the way she walked out of here like I was nothing. You're not nothing, Marcus said firmly. You're the alpha of this pack. You saved us from annihilation. I saved us by finally listening to someone I'd spent 7 years ignoring, Damon interrupted. Do you know what she told me the last time I saw her? She said I should find an advisor who actually wants to be here. Someone who chooses to serve rather than being forced into it. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Damon. She was right. About everything. I spent so long demanding respect that I never learned how to earn it. I was so focused on maintaining control that I never learned how to inspire loyalty. Damon's voice was flat, emotionless. She figured that out in 5 days of imprisonment. I'm 32 years old and only learning it now. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the study door. One of the younger maids, a girl named Sarah who'd worked alongside Arya for years, peered nervously around the doorframe. Alpha, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cook needs to know about the menu for tomorrow's council meeting. Should she prepare the usual, or? She trailed off, clearly expecting the sharp rebuke that used to follow any interruption of Damon's work time. Instead, he set down his pen entirely and gave her his full attention. What would you recommend, Sarah? He asked, his tone gentle in a way that made the girl's eyes widen with surprise. What? You know the preferences of the council members better than I do. What menu would make them most comfortable? Sarah stared at him for several long moments, clearly waiting for the trap or trick that had to be hidden in such an unprecedented question. When none materialized, she began speaking hesitantly. Well, Beta Marcus prefers the roasted lamb, but Councilmember Harrison can't digest red meat properly. Elder Thompson always compliments Cook's herb-crusted chicken, and Councilmember Rivers mentioned last time that the lemon tarts reminded her of her grandmother's recipe. She continued for several minutes, detailing the dietary preferences and food-related comments of every person who would be attending the meeting. Damon listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes. Excellent suggestions, he said when she finished. Please tell Cook to prepare accordingly, and let her know that I appreciate her flexibility in accommodating everyone's preferences. Sarah bobbed a confused curtsy and hurried away, leaving Marcus staring at his alpha with something approaching shock. What was that? Marcus demanded. What was what? You just spent 15 minutes discussing catering preferences with a maid. And you acted like her opinions actually mattered. Damon frowned as if this were a perfectly normal interaction. They do matter. She knows things I don't know. Information that can make the difference between a productive meeting and an uncomfortable one. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Because, damn it, Damon was right. The old approach would have been to bark an order about the usual menu, and then wonder why Council Member Harrison looked miserable throughout the entire meeting. Over the following days, Marcus began to notice other changes in Damon's behavior. Small things at first, but they accumulated like drops of water, eventually carving new channels in stone. Damon began ending conversations with "thank you" instead of dismissive nods. He started asking servants about their families, their concerns, their opinions on pack matters that affected their daily lives. When giving orders, he began explaining the reasoning behind them, turning commands into collaborative discussions. Most surprisingly, he began admitting when he didn't know something or when he'd made a mistake. I was wrong about the guard rotation schedule, he announced during one weekly staff meeting, causing several jaws to drop around the conference table. The current system leaves the eastern perimeter understaffed during shift changes. Does anyone have suggestions for improvement? The old Damon would have blamed subordinates for the oversight. This new version took responsibility and asked for input from the people who actually worked the schedules. The changes weren't lost on his family either. During a dinner that had once been a minefield of tension and careful conversation, Elena finally worked up the courage to comment. "You're different," she said, cutting her roasted vegetables with unnecessary precision. Ever since the crisis. You're calmer." Calmer? Damon considered the word thoughtfully. "I suppose I am." "It's more than that," his father added, studying his son's face across the dinner table. "You're more present. More aware of the people around you. You used to eat dinner like you were reviewing reports," his mother chimed in with a small smile. "Now you actually seem to notice what you're eating. And who you're eating with." Damon set down his fork and looked around the table at his family, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in years. His parents, growing older but still sharp and engaged. His sister, intelligent and capable but always walking on eggshells around his temper. His younger brother David, home from university and clearly more relaxed than Damon remembered him being in months. "I've been a terrible brother," he said suddenly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "And a worse son." "Damon," his mother began. "No, it's true." He turned to David, seeing his youngest sibling with fresh eyes. "When did you start wearing glasses?" David blinked in surprise, his hand automatically going to the wire-rimmed frames perched on his nose. "I've had them for 8 months. 8 months. Damon had seen his brother countless times during that period and had never noticed. Had never asked about his studies, his health, his life beyond his usefulness to pack functions. "I'm sorry," Damon said quietly. "I've been so focused on being alpha that I forgot how to be family." The admission hung in the air like a revelation. His father cleared his throat, his expression a mixture of surprise and something that might have been pride. "What brought this on?" Elena asked gently. "This, self-reflection?" Damon was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. How could he explain that a servant girl had taught him more about leadership in 1 week than he'd learned in 10 years of being alpha? How could he describe the way her quiet dignity had shown him the difference between commanding respect and earning it? "Someone very wise once told me that respect can't be demanded," he said finally. "It has to be earned. I spent so long trying to control people that I never learned how to connect with them." "Someone wise?" his mother prompted. "Someone I treated very badly for a very long time," Damon replied, his voice heavy with regret. "Someone who deserved much better than what I gave her." The conversation moved on to other topics after that, but Damon found himself thinking about Aria's words long into the night. Not just her parting observations about his leadership style, but all the small moments he'd never paid attention to. The way she'd moved through the house like a ghost, making herself invisible to avoid his notice. The careful neutrality of her expression whenever their paths crossed. The years of quiet service that he'd taken for granted without ever considering the person providing it. He'd never asked her about her dreams. Never inquired about her interests or hopes or fears. Never acknowledged her as anything more than a useful tool that happened to have human form. And yet, when the crisis came, she'd been the one with the strength to stand up to him. The wisdom to see through his bluster to the frightened man beneath. The courage to walk away from security in pursuit of something he was only beginning to understand the value of. Freedom. Not just political or financial freedom, but the deeper liberation that came from knowing your own worth regardless of what others thought of you. 3 weeks after her departure, Damon finally understood what he'd lost. Not just a translator or a servant or even a potential advisor. He'd lost someone who could have taught him things about leadership and life that no amount of alpha training could provide. Someone who had taught him those things, even if he'd been too proud and stubborn to listen at the time. The realization came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. He wasn't mourning the loss of her skills or her usefulness. He was mourning the loss of her, the quiet strength that had sustained her through years of hardship, the intelligence that had saved his pack, the dignity that had finally taught him the difference between power and leadership. For the first time in his adult life, Alpha Damon Blackwood understood that there were some things that couldn't be commanded, controlled, or conquered. Some gifts could only be given freely, and some lessons could only be learned through loss. The question now was what he intended to do with that knowledge. As he sat in his study that night, surrounded by the trappings of power that had once seemed so important, Damon found himself staring out the window toward the road that led away from the estate. Somewhere out there, Arya was living the life she'd chosen for herself. Free from his demands, his expectations, his need to control everything and everyone around him. He hoped she was happy. More than that, he hoped she was discovering all the things about herself that years of servitude had forced her to bury. And perhaps, if he was very lucky and very persistent in becoming the man she'd challenged him to be, someday he might be worthy of asking for the chance to be part of that discovery. But first, he had to finish learning the lessons she'd already taught him. Starting with the hardest one of all, how to earn the love he'd always tried to command. Chapter 8. The autumn morning was crisp with promise as Arya knelt among her tomato plants, carefully harvesting the last of the season's crop. 2 months of peaceful mornings had given her garden time to flourish, and she discovered an unexpected talent for coaxing life from soil. Her hands, once constantly trembling from anxiety, now moved with steady confidence as she selected the ripest fruit. The cottage behind her had become everything she'd never dared to dream of, a sanctuary where she could wake each morning without fear, where she could choose how to spend her hours, where the only voice commanding her attention was her own. The small town of Millbrook had embraced her as simply Arya, with no knowledge of pack politics or ancient languages or the servant girl she'd once been. Here, she was just a woman who tended her garden, bought books from the local shop, and sometimes sat on her porch in the evenings watching the stars emerge over the valley. It was a quiet life, perhaps unremarkable to some, but to someone who had never owned even her own time, it felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. She was so absorbed in her harvest that she didn't hear the car pull into her gravel driveway. Didn't notice the footsteps approaching around the side of the cottage. It wasn't until a familiar shadow fell across her tomato plants that she looked up, her hands still full of sun-warmed fruit. Damon Blackwood stood at the edge of her garden, and for a moment, neither of them moved. He looked different. The change was subtle but unmistakable, something in his posture, in the way he held himself. Gone was the aggressive confidence that had always surrounded him like armor. In its place was something quieter, more grounded. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a dark sweater instead of the expensive suits that had been his uniform, and his dark hair was slightly longer, less severely styled. But it was his eyes that showed the most dramatic change. Where once they had burned with constant anger and the need to dominate, now they held something Arya had never seen before, humility. "Hello, Arya," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the commanding edge she remembered. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." Arya sat back on her heels, studying his face with the careful attention she'd once reserved for reading ancient texts. 2 months ago, his unexpected appearance would have sent her into a panic. Now, she felt only cautious curiosity. How did you find me? She asked, her tone neutral. It wasn't difficult. Small towns talk, especially about newcomers who pay cash for property and keep to themselves. He paused, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that seemed almost nervous. I didn't come to drag you back, if that's what you're worried about. No? Arya rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her knees. Then why did you come? Damon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze taking in the cottage, the well-tended garden, the peaceful expression on her face that he'd never seen during her years of service. You look happy, he said finally. I am happy. The simple truth of it rang in her voice. For the first time in my adult life, I'm genuinely happy. Something flickered across his features, pain, perhaps, or regret. I'm glad. You deserve happiness. You deserved it then, and you deserve it now. The words hung between them like an offering. Arya tilted her head, studying the stranger who wore Damon's face but spoke with a gentleness she'd never heard from him before. What do you want, Damon? She asked, but without the edge of defensiveness that would have colored the question 2 months ago. She was no longer afraid of him, no longer prepared to shrink from his presence. If anything, she was curious about what had brought the former tyrant to her garden with such careful humility. To apologize, he said simply. Properly this time. Not because I needed something from you, but because you deserved to hear it. Arya crossed her arms, the basket of tomatoes balanced against her hip. I'm listening. Damon took a breath, and she could see him gathering his thoughts with the same care she'd once used to translate ancient texts. I was cruel to you, he began, his voice steady but weighted with genuine remorse. For 7 years, I treated you like you were nothing more than furniture with the inconvenient ability to feel pain. I never asked about your dreams, your fears, your hopes for the future. I never acknowledged that you had thoughts or opinions or desires that mattered. I made you invisible in your own life. He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that seemed uncharacteristically vulnerable. I told myself I was protecting you by giving you shelter and work, but the truth is I was using you. I took your labor, your intelligence, your quiet strength, and I gave you nothing in return except the privilege of surviving another day in my presence. Arya listened without interrupting, seeing something in his face she'd never witnessed before, a man confronting his own failures without excuses or justifications. When you stood up to me in that medical wing, Damon continued, when you looked me in the eye and said no, it was the first time anyone had ever forced me to see myself clearly. And what I saw was someone who had spent so long demanding respect that he'd forgotten how to earn it. And what changed? Arya asked quietly. What made you finally see it? Losing you. The admission came out raw, honest. Not losing your skills or your usefulness, but losing you. The woman who had survived everything I put her through and still found the strength to walk away with her dignity intact. He took a step closer, but not close enough to crowd her space. Everything about his approach was careful, respectful of her boundaries in a way the old Damon never would have been. These past 2 months, I've been learning how to be the kind of leader you challenged me to become. I listen more than I speak. I ask for opinions instead of demanding compliance. I treat pack members like people instead of assets. A small, rueful smile crossed his features. My beta thinks I've lost my mind because I spent 20 minutes yesterday discussing optimal kindergarten snack schedules with one of the mother wolves. Despite herself, Arya felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. Kindergarten snacks? Apparently, some of the pups have food allergies, and the teachers were struggling to accommodate everyone without making anyone feel left out. She had ideas about rotation schedules and allergy-free alternatives that were actually brilliant once I stopped thinking of her as just a parent volunteer. The image of the former tyrant earnestly discussing fruit cup alternatives was so absurd that Arya couldn't suppress a small laugh. And did you implement her suggestions? Of course. She knows more about feeding picky 5-year-olds than I ever will. His expression grew more serious. That's what you tried to tell me, isn't it? That the people around me had knowledge and wisdom I was ignoring because I was too proud to listen. Arya nodded slowly. Among other things, yes. I've been thinking about all the other things you said. About respect and dignity and the difference between commanding loyalty and earning it. He met her eyes directly. You were right about everything. I was a tyrant who mistook fear for respect and compliance for loyalty. Was? Arya asked, noting his use of past tense. I'm trying very hard not to be anymore. His voice carried a vulnerability she'd never heard from him. The pack is different now. Better, I think. People speak up in meetings instead of just agreeing with whatever I say. Servants correct me when I'm wrong instead of suffering in silence. My family actually enjoys dinner together because they're not walking on eggshells around my temper. He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground between them. I'm different. Because you showed me that real strength isn't about making others smaller. It's about lifting them up. Real leadership isn't about being feared, it's about being trusted. Arya set down her basket of tomatoes and really looked at him, searching for signs of the man who had thrown her into basement cells for the crime of refusing to be commanded. She found traces of him in the set of his shoulders, the strong line of his jaw, the intensity that would always be part of his nature. But the cruelty was gone. The need to dominate, the hair-trigger temper, the assumption that others existed solely to serve his will, all of it had been replaced by something she never would have expected. Genuine humility. You really have changed, she said, and it wasn't a question. I'm trying to. Every day. He looked up at her again, and she saw something else in his eyes now, hope, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. Which brings me to why I'm really here. Arya felt her pulse quicken, though whether from anxiety or anticipation, she couldn't say. Which is? Damon was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him choosing his words with the same care she'd once used to navigate his unpredictable moods. I've come to ask if you would consider coming back, he said finally. Not as a servant. Not as an employee. Not as someone who exists to make my life easier or solve my problems. He took a breath, and she could see the courage it required for him to continue. I've come to ask if you would consider being my mate. My equal partner. My Luna. The words hit her like a physical force. Arya stared at him, certain she must have misheard. You're what? My mate, he repeated, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. I know it sounds impossible. I know I have no right to ask after everything I put you through. But Arya, losing you made me realize something I was too proud and stupid to see before. Which is? That I'm in love with you. The confession came out quietly, but with absolute certainty. Not with your skills or your usefulness or your ability to solve my problems. I'm in love with your strength. With the way you survived years of cruelty and still found the courage to stand up for yourself when it mattered. With your dignity and your intelligence and the quiet grace that carried you through everything I put you through. Arya felt the world tilt around her. In all her dreams of freedom, in all her fantasies of what her life might become, she had never imagined this moment. You barely knew I existed for 7 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was blind, Damon admitted. Completely, willfully blind. I saw what I wanted to see, a useful servant who asked for nothing and gave everything. I never looked deeper because I was afraid of what I might find. Afraid of what? Afraid that you were better than me. Stronger, wiser, more capable of real leadership than I ever was. His smile was rueful. Turns out I was right to be afraid. You were all of those things. You still are. Arya walked to the small bench she'd placed beside her garden, needing to sit down as she processed what he was telling her. Damon remained where he was, giving her space to think. If I came back, she said slowly, what would that look like? What are you actually offering me? Partnership, he said without hesitation. Real partnership. You would be Luna, not just in title, but in authority. Equal say in pack decisions. Equal respect from pack members. Your own domain and responsibilities that don't revolve around serving my needs. He moved closer, but still maintained a respectful distance. I'm offering you the chance to help me build something better than what we had before. A pack where strength is measured by how well we care for each other, not by how effectively we dominate our enemies. A community where everyone's voice matters, where leadership means service, not superiority. And if we disagree about something important? Arya asked. If I challenge your decisions publicly? Then we work it out together, like partners do. I won't always be right, Arya. I'm still learning how to lead with wisdom instead of fear. I need someone beside me who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm making mistakes. Someone who isn't afraid of you, you mean? Someone who sees me clearly and chooses to stay anyway, he corrected gently. Someone who believes I can be better than I was and isn't afraid to hold me accountable when I fall short. Arya was quiet for a long time, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. The cottage around her represented safety, peace, the freedom to be herself without fear or obligation. Returning to the pack would mean giving up that security for uncertainty, trading her hard-won independence for the complex dynamics of leadership and partnership. But it would also mean something else. The chance to help build the kind of community she dreamed of during her darkest moments in service. The opportunity to ensure that no one else would experience what she'd endured. The possibility of love, real love, chosen freely between equals. I need to know, she said finally, that you're not just offering this because you've romanticized our conflict. I need to know you understand that choosing me means choosing someone who will never go back to being invisible or silent or grateful for scraps. I don't want you invisible or silent, Damon said firmly. I want you exactly as you are right now, strong, independent, unafraid to speak your mind. I want a partner who challenges me to be better, not someone who enables me to stay the same. And if the pack doesn't accept me as Luna? If they see me as nothing more than an upstart servant? Then they'll learn differently. Anyone who can't respect my mate doesn't belong in my pack. His voice carried a note of the old alpha authority, but tempered now with protective rather than possessive instincts. Besides, half of them are already talking about the mysterious translator who saved us all. They know your worth, even if they don't know your name. Arya stood up from the bench and walked to where he waited, close enough now to see the hope and vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. If I said yes, she said slowly, it wouldn't be because I need you or your pack or the security you're offering. It would be because I choose you. Because I see who you're becoming and want to be part of that journey. I understand. And it wouldn't be a return to the way things were. It would be stepping into something entirely new, with new rules and new expectations. I'm counting on it. Arya studied his face one more time, looking for any trace of the man who had commanded her fear for so many years. Instead, she saw someone who had been broken down and rebuilt, who had chosen growth over comfort and humility over pride. In her dreams the night before, her mother had appeared one last time. Some people are capable of true change, little wolf, Elena had said, her dream voice warm with understanding. Not everyone, but some. The question is whether you're brave enough to believe in that possibility. Looking at Damon now, seeing the genuine transformation in his eyes, Arya realized she was brave enough. Not because she needed him, but because she wanted the chance to build something beautiful with someone who had proven he could grow. Yes, she said quietly. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning the distance between their past and their future. Yes? Damon repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Yes, I'll come back with you. Yes, I'll be your mate and your Luna and your equal partner. Arya smiled, feeling the rightness of the decision settle into her bones. But I'm keeping the cottage. Damon's face broke into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. Of course. It's yours. Everything that's yours remains yours. I'm not asking you to give up anything, I'm asking you to add something new. Good, Arya said, stepping closer until she was near enough to touch him if she chose. Because I've learned the difference between sacrifice and choice, and I'm only interested in choices now. Then choose me, Damon said softly, his voice carrying all the hope and love and desperate sincerity of a man who had finally learned what really mattered. Choose us. Choose the possibility of what we could build together. Arya reached up and touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin under her palm and seeing the wonder in his eyes as he realized she was touching him by choice, not command. I choose you, she said. I choose us. I choose the chance to build something better than what came before. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the forceful dominance she might have expected from the old daemon. Instead, it was gentle, questioning, a request rather than a demand. And when she kissed him back, it was with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth and had chosen to share it freely. The autumn sun warmed their shoulders as they stood in her garden, two people who had found each other not through circumstance or necessity, but through the much rarer gift of genuine transformation. Around them, the cottage waited peacefully, ready to become a sanctuary they could return to whenever the complexities of leadership became too much. But for now, they had each other. They had the promise of partnership built on respect rather than fear, love offered freely rather than demanded through force. They had the chance to prove that sometimes, people really could change for the better. And in the distance, a pack waited for the return of their alpha and the arrival of their new Luna, both of them ready to lead not through dominance, but through the much more powerful force of earned trust and chosen love. The servant girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth. The tyrant had been transformed into a leader who understood that true strength came from lifting others up. And together, they would build something neither could have created alone, a love story written not in the language of power and submission, but in the much more beautiful dialect of equality and choice. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and possibilities, but they would face it as they had chosen to face everything else from now on, together, as equals, with the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to let go of the need to control everything. In her final dream, Arya's mother smiled and whispered words of blessing that would follow them into their new life. Well chosen, little wolf. Well chosen indeed. Epilogue. 1 year later. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of what had once been called the Alpha's study, but was now simply known as the office, a space shared equally by the pack's two leaders. Arya sat behind the mahogany desk that had once intimidated her, reviewing correspondence from other packs who had heard about their innovative approach to pack governance and wanted to learn more. The Western Mountain Pack is requesting a formal visit, she said, looking up at Damon, who was reviewing training schedules near the window. They want to observe our council meetings and discuss implementing similar collaborative leadership structures. Damon smiled, an expression that came easily to him now. That's the fourth request this month. Word is spreading that democracy and werewolves actually can coexist. Imagine that, Arya said with mock surprise. It turns out people work harder when they have a voice in decisions that affect their lives. A soft knock interrupted their morning routine. Sarah, the maid who had once trembled in this very room, peeked around the door with the confidence of someone who knew her opinions were valued. Luna Arya, Alpha Daemon, she said, using the titles with warmth rather than fear. Cook wants to confirm the menu for tonight's celebration, and little Emma Hartwell is here for her language lesson. Arya's face lit up. The language lessons had been her idea, teaching interested pack members to read ancient texts so that crucial knowledge wouldn't rest with just one person. Emma, Dr. Hartwell's 8-year-old granddaughter, had shown remarkable aptitude for the old dialects. Send Emma in, Arya said. And tell Cook that the menu she suggested sounds perfect. Her instincts about pack preferences are always better than mine. Sarah beamed at the compliment and hurried away. A moment later, a small girl with bright eyes and pigtails bounded into the office, carrying a worn notebook and pencil case. Luna Arya. Emma chirped, climbing into the chair beside the desk with practiced ease. I've been practicing the symbols you taught me last week. Want to see? Always, Arya replied, genuinely delighted. She watched as Emma carefully drew out ancient characters with the same concentration Arya had once applied to translating threats of war. But these lessons were different. They were about knowledge shared freely, understanding passed down through choice rather than desperation. This one means friendship, right? Emma asked, pointing to a complex symbol. Perfect. And this one? Strength through unity, Emma recited proudly. Exactly right. You're becoming quite the scholar. As they worked through the lesson, Damon found himself marveling at the scene. A year ago, this room had been a place of tension and fear. Now it was filled with laughter and learning, with the sounds of a pack that trusted its leaders because those leaders trusted them in return. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been resistance from some pack members who preferred the old hierarchical ways. There had been mistakes and miscommunications as they figured out how to balance decisive leadership with collaborative decision-making. There had been nights when both Arya and Damon wondered if they were trying to change too much too quickly. But there had also been moments like this, small victories that proved the new approach was working. Pack members who spoke up in meetings instead of staying silent. Children who ran to their leaders with scraped knees and exciting discoveries instead of scurrying away in fear. Wolves who took pride in their community because they helped shape it. "Emma," Damon said gently, "would you like to see something special?" The little girl looked up from her notebook with eager curiosity. Damon walked to a cabinet that Arya hadn't seen him open before and withdrew a leather portfolio. From it, he pulled a framed document written in the ancient script Emma was learning. "This is the original Treaty of Silver Moon," he explained, bringing it over for her to see. "The one that helped save our pack. Your Luna was the first person to read these words in over 50 years. Emma's eyes widened as she studied the ancient symbols. "Luna Arya, you must be really smart to read something so old and important." "Smart enough to know that knowledge is only valuable when it's shared," Arya replied, ruffling the girl's hair. "Which is why I'm teaching it to brilliant students like you." A comfortable routine had developed over the past year. Mornings in the shared office, working through pack business together. Afternoons split between their individual responsibilities, Arya with diplomatic correspondence and language preservation, Damon with security and territory management. Evenings at the cottage, which had become their private retreat from the demands of leadership. The cottage had been expanded slightly, with a small addition that housed Arya's growing library of ancient texts and translation notes. But it remained their sanctuary, a place where they could simply be Arya and Damon rather than Luna and Alpha. "Luna Arya," Emma said, finishing the last exercise in her notebook, "my mom says you used to be scared of Alpha Damon. Is that true?" The question was delivered with the blunt curiosity of childhood, and both adults froze for a moment. They had been honest with the pack about their history, but explaining complex relationship dynamics to an 8-year-old required delicate phrasing. "I was scared of him," Arya said carefully. "Because he wasn't very good at being kind back then. But people can learn and change, even grown-ups. And your Alpha worked very hard to become the kind of person who deserves to be trusted." Emma considered this with the seriousness of youth. "Like how I had to learn not to pull Cooper's tail after he bit me?" "Very much like that," Damon said, fighting back a smile. "Sometimes we have to learn lessons the hard way before we understand how to treat others properly." "And now you're married and happy?" "Now we're mated and very happy," Arya confirmed. "Good," Emma said with satisfaction. "I like happy endings." As they walked Emma to the door, promising to continue her lessons next week, Arya reflected on how much truth there was in the child's simple observation. This did feel like a happy ending, but more than that, it felt like a happy beginning. That evening, as they sat on the cottage porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Damon reached for Arya's hand with the same wonder that still surprised him whenever she chose his touch. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The simplicity of your life here before I showed up to complicate everything?" Arya considered the question, looking out over the garden that had been her first taste of freedom. "Sometimes I miss the peace of having no responsibilities beyond my own happiness," she admitted. "But I don't miss being alone with that peace." She turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the love that had grown from the ashes of their complicated beginning. "Besides," she added with a smile, "someone has to make sure you don't backslide into tyranny. It's a full-time job, but the benefits are excellent." Damon laughed, the sound rich and warm in the evening air. "The benefits?" Arya leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that now represented protection rather than threat. Great dental plan, unlimited vacation time at a cottage in the mountains, and a partner who's finally learned the difference between asking and demanding. "I'm still learning," Damon said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Every day. We both are. That's what makes it interesting." As night fell around them, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts of how far they'd traveled from that terrible night when ancient letters had threatened to destroy everything. The threats had been neutralized, the pack had flourished, and two people who had started as master and servant had discovered they could become something much more powerful as equals. In the distance, lights began twinkling in the pack house windows, their people settling in for the night, secure in the knowledge that they were protected by leaders who valued their voices and respected their worth. Children like Emma would grow up never knowing what it felt like to live in fear of their alpha's temper. Servants like Sarah would never experience the crushing invisibility that had defined Arya's early years. "Thank you," Damon said suddenly. "For what?" "For seeing who I could become instead of only who I was. For believing that people can change. For choosing to love me anyway." Arya squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a leader who now worked alongside his people rather than simply commanding them from afar. "Thank you," she replied, "for proving that I was right to believe." Above them, stars began appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their painful beginning and now blessed their chosen future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love built on respect was stronger than power built on fear. But tonight, they had this, the peace of the cottage, the warmth of each other's presence, and the quiet satisfaction of two people who had fought their way to a happiness that nobody could take away because they had earned it together. In her dreams that night, Arya's mother appeared one final time, her face radiant with joy and pride. "You did well, little wolf," Elena whispered. "You found your strength, claimed your worth, and chose your path with wisdom. Rest now in the knowledge that you have built something beautiful from the ashes of pain. Your story is complete, and it ends with love freely given and joyfully received." When Arya woke in the morning, wrapped in Damon's arms in their own bed in their own cottage, she carried her mother's blessing into the new day like a benediction. Some stories ended with rescue. Others ended with revenge. But the best stories, the ones worth telling and retelling, ended with transformation, with people becoming their best selves through the choice to love and be loved in return. And this, Arya knew with quiet certainty, was the very best kind of story of all. Thank you for listening to this story. Like, share and subscribe for more.